So as mentioned earlier, quantitative consumer tests are usually either um, acceptance or preference tests. So each of these two major types of tests have different uses. And let's look at acceptance tests first. So karamihan sa inyo na naka-attend na sa isang sensory test either by my former students or yung mga nagsisisis noon sa college would likely have attended acceptance tests. Okay, you went there was a food sample before you, and you were asked how much you liked or disliked certain attributes of the food. So in general, acceptance test utilizes scales to ask us how much we like or dislike the food, no, yung feelings natin about the food. In certain cases, you may design a test to correlated to actual utilization, although this is rare for a qualitative test, or a quantitative test rather. Then we usually use scales, which are at least ordinal in nature, but they could be interval as well if they're pretty good, pretty well made. And usually yun lang ang sinusukat talaga natin. How much do you like or dislike the food, or is this food acceptable to you? Ang acceptance test, pwede siyang single sample. You're not comparing the product to anything else except the scale. Or you could use it on multiple products, in which case you could use statistics and hypothesis testing to test for significant differences in acceptability. Okay, but again, two products having the same acceptability does not mean they taste the same. It just means pareha silang ganito yung level ng pagkatanggap nung tinest mo na subpopulation. So the typical question for an acceptance test is how much do you like the product, or how acceptable is the product to you. Although this gives us an estimate of product acceptance, of course, there are many other factors that may affect real-life marketing. So as I said before, merong isang hotdog brand noon na hindi siya masyadong sikat, pero yung lasa niya, yung overall acceptability niya was better than most of the other na mas sikat na brand, and it was actually on par with the top brand. Pero bakit hindi siya ganun kasikat? Siguro wala masyadong advertisement, they haven't been in the market for so long or something, or maybe they don't have as much reach if their supply can only reach Metro Manila and a few provinces, perhaps. So the hedonic scale is the most common method used. You have the 5, 7, and 9-point scale. Actually, there's even an 11-point scale, the labeled effective magnitude scale, and I'll bring that up in the next slide. Okay, there's also the food action rating scale, which measures the product acceptance and general attitude of the product. However, this type of scale is somewhat obsolete already. So the most common scale used for acceptance test is a 9-point hedonic scale, wherein you have 9 discrete response alternatives. This is actually considered as interval in nature, wherein dislike extremely is given a value of 1, like extremely is given a value of 9, 5 is neither like nor dislike, and supposedly the psychological distance between each point is equal, such that you can treat it more like an interval scale rather than a simple ordinal scale. So technically, pag statistical analysis ang ginagamit mo dito, pwede kang gumamit ng parametric statistics. Ito naman yung food action rating scale. Again, this was somewhat proven to be not as useful. Okay, although it does measure the frequency of consumption. Pero alam naman natin that frequency of consumption is not just about liking. You make like a certain product na alam mong unhealthy, and you know that you will only consume it a few times a month at most because of its possible effect on your body in the long term, for example. So here we have examples of scales for children. This one has faces and this one are just words. So typically it has been proven na mas okay yung words lang at the very least, no, kasi the younger children won't be able to uh, essentially associate yung mga emoticons to at least an ordinal level of ascending or descending acceptability. But they would understand what super good and super bad is. So sometimes kahit wala na yung mga mukha, okay lang. And usually the younger the panelists, like yung mga nasa 3 to 4 years old, ano lang ang gamit sa kanila, 3-point scales lang, baka ito lang, no, yung gitna. And then as they grow older, 5-year-olds can use up to 7-point scales and so on. On the other hand, as I mentioned, there's also what we call the labeled effective magnitude scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 points. Kung makikita nyo dito, unlike the 9-point hedonic scale na same yung interval sa kada response, dito hindi, no? So, inaral po nila ito at nalaman nila na yung actual psychological distance apparently for those terms. As you can see here, it's like a 9-point hedonic scale in terms of the choices, except that you have two choices at the top and bottom, the greatest imaginable. Okay, so the LAMS is a 0 to 100 scale. Kung gagawin mo siyang based on a 0, or kung gusto mo may negative, it's a minus 100 to positive 100 scale. And of course, you can treat this at the very least as interval data, no? So, mahirap siyang pilitin na ratio kasi sasabihin mo ang 0 mo ay yung greatest imaginable dislike. Okay? And now it becomes a scale with two sides, the like side and the dislike side. But nonetheless, it's possible to use this. And kung ito yung gagamitin mo, for example, you're gonna treat it as a 0 to 100 interval scale. When you translate the data, for example, if a panelist answers like very much, then you code that numerical value as 78.06 and so on, and then you treat it like just like any other numerical data set using parametric tests. So there are many other acceptance tests. Nandyan yung just about right scale and so on and so forth. However, can read them siguro na lang on your own, but these are the basic ones that we'll be discussing for this module. So for statistical analysis, a 7-point hedonic scale and below usually mas accurate na gumamit ng non-parametric tests. While for the 9-point and 11-point hedonic scale, it's possible to use parametric test kasi nga medyo mas malapit sa interval yung pagiging data nila. While yung 7-point hedonic scale and below, especially kung kayo lang yung gumawa ng mga salita, ay considered na ordinal lang and therefore by default ay naka-non-parametric sila. Okay? So the type of test would depend on whether you are using single sample, two sample, or multiple samples, no? So meron namang mga counterpart yan, no? So for the 9-point hedonic scale, you have your t-tests and your ANOVA, and for the 7-point hedonic scale below, you have your non-parametric counterparts. So pag preference naman ay sinasukat natin yung relative preference using between at least two products. No? So meron kang nilalatag sa iyo ng mga produkto, 2 or more, and you either choose one over the other or rank them according to your degree of liking. So it goes without saying in this case, very ordinal yung nature ng mga test natin. No, kasi even though you prefer one over the other, that does not necessarily quantify the degree of difference between two or more preferred, or the preferred versus the lesser preferred option. So, anong mas gusto mo? Chicken Joy o McChicken? Pepsi versus Coke? Yung fries ng McDo versus fries ng Jollibee? Or maybe if you're made to choose among all the quick service restaurant burgers, which one do you like the best? Okay, so ito yung mga klase ng tanong sa preference. Usually, hindi mo ini-indicate yung characteristic. So, overall siya. No? Kasi medyo magkakabias ka kapag nagtanong ka, anong appearance mas gusto mo? Anong lasa mas gusto mo? Overall, anong mas gusto mo? Okay. So, typically, this is used to compare products and napaka-market oriented niya, lalo na kung competitor yung pinagtatapat mo. Pero pwede rin naman na, let's say you have two formulations and then you cannot decide. Alam ko na, let's let the consumers decide kung alin dito sa dalawang ginawa natin yung mas maigi na i-launch sa market. It's also possible to use this when comparing, let's say, a new and older product. So let's say if you're doing a new and improved ad and you want statistical basis to say that this product has been improved, then preference test indicating that the new formulation is significantly preferred over the other might be a good uh, way to substantiate your claims. So typically the most common is the paired preference test wherein you have two samples and then usually sabay siyang pine-present kasi nga kung sequential, well, balance order of presentation would eliminate the bias. Pero kung gusto mo nga siyang i-compare, ang intention mo talaga is to have them side by side, di ba? Parehas mong makita, parehas mong maamoy, and so on, instead of relying on memory. So in this case, you may or may not require your panelists to make a choice. However, generally, yung forced choice na method, mas madali siyang i-analyze statistically. Kasi kung meron kang no choice, syempre, parang ang lalabas nun, may tatlong possible na answer. Sample A, sample B, and neither of the two. Or yung no choice could be neither or both are equally preferred, di ba? So, mas mahirap i-stat yun. So, paired preference tests, napakasimple niya gawin. So, ayan yung sample instructions. Tapos, kung makikita ninyo, parang wala siyang ina-identify na dimensions overall agad and just choose one sample, which one do you like better? And you must be clear on your instructions if force sila mag-choose. Sometimes lalagay mo dito na neither like na, I like neither or I like both. I prefer both equally, sorry. And statistical analysis to be applied here are those based on frequency distribution. So, ang assumption lang natin is that if both are preferred equally, then you have the population overall would have an equal chance na half would choose this sample, half would choose that. So parang same lang sa mga triangle and duotria, you need a minimum number of responses indicating that one product was chosen more than the other. Typically, this could be two-tailed kung wala kang gustong manok na manalo dun sa dalawang choices. Like, curious ka lang na gusto mo malaman, once and for all, Jollibee ba o McDo? Pero kung halimbawa, you're having a new formulation and you want that new formulation to be significantly preferred, then that becomes a one-tailed test towards yung manok mo na sample. Whenever you have 3 or more samples presented simultaneously for a preference type test, this is already called ranking, no? Kasi ino-order mo na, this is my first in preference, second, and third. Okay? So, similar din siya sa paired preference, pero dumami lang yung sample and you now have to ordinally rank them. Okay? So, obviously, this only gives you a relative preference among the samples tested at one time, and it doesn't really get to measure how much the first is preferred over the other. Alam mo lang na mas maraming pumili nito as rank 1, pero you don't really know in reality yung psychological distance between rank 1 and rank 2, how big is it. Okay, and since the comparison is relative, kumpara mo sa, let's say, nag-acceptance test ka na lang, kahit na rank 1 yung sample, hindi mo alam kung yung acceptability pala niya ay like slightly or like extremely. Okay? So typically for these tests, you could use the Basker's tables or the Friedman test. parang mga rank sum test yung ginagamit dito. Statistically, they add up the ranks and do some sort of statistical treatment to tell you kung yung rank sums constitute an actual statistical difference or not. Okay, here is an example of ranking test instructions, and of course my specification that ties are not allowed. So let's try working with sample data here, assuming you have 5 panelists as shown and 4 samples to be ranked. First, you add up the rank totals for each sample. Then you use the Friedman test equation to get the chi-squared test statistic, which will then be compared to a tabular value. So again, our null hypothesis is that the products are equally preferred, while the alternative hypothesis is that the products are not equally preferred, which is a two-way multi-correlation. One product may be more preferred than the others and so on. So based on the rank totals, if you input it into the equations, taking into consideration having 4 samples, in this case 5 panelists, and then the square of the individual rank totals, and then considering that our degree of freedom is the number of samples minus 1, so that's 3. So we can get a chi-squared statistic value of 9.72. So we now compare our computed value to the tabular value under 3 degrees of freedom and our alpha of 0.05, and the value we would compare it to is highlighted here. And since our test statistic value is higher than the tabular value, then we would accept the alternative hypothesis. And so now that we know that they are significantly different, we want to know which among the pairs of samples are significantly different from each other. A versus B, B versus C, C versus D, A versus D, B versus C, and so on. So to do that, we need to do a computation for the least significant rank difference using this equation. You can use this table to find the small letter t based on the degree of freedom and the alpha level. In this case, the t, which is the multiplier for the LSRD equation, is highlighted here. So take note that this is a different table from the one in the previous slides. Okay, so again, small letter t is only used to compute for the LSRD. And this LSRD would tell us if the any 2 pairs of samples are significantly different. So now that we've calculated the LSRD, we manually take the rank totals, and for each pair of samples, we get the difference between their rank totals and compare them to the LSRD value. Since the rank totals are whole numbers, we might as well consider the LSRD to be around 10. So, kapag yung rank difference niya is 10 or higher, then those pairs are significantly different. Kapag ang rank difference is 9 or lower, then those pairs are not significantly different. So you can see here that we have, in this case, 6 pairs to consider, and that we have here conveniently noted the significance groupings. Okay, so again, we interpret this by saying that those numbers with the same letter superscripts are not significantly different. So therefore, we've summarized these 6 notations here into the 4 samples having 2 significant preference grouping. So D versus C based on these letters are not significantly different kasi pareha silang may superscript na A. And then A, B, and C are not significantly different from each other in terms of preference because they all have the superscript B. However, D is significantly different from both B and A because they don't share any of the same superscripts. So that's how significance groupings work. So lastly, quantitative tests are also categorized based on their location. Yung madalas nating ginagawa is the laboratory test wherein the panelists are asked to come to the sensory evaluation lab of the company or academic institution. We also have what we call the central location test, wherein you bring your sensory lab to wherever your panelists are, whether that be a mall, a school, no, meron kayong laboratory on wheels, or you set up a collapsible lab in a suitable room or outdoor location. And also there is the home use test wherein bibisita kayo dun sa bahay ng participant, or you will ask the participant with some instructions to use their products in the context of their own homes, and you would maybe have a form or some sort of feedback from them. So typically yung home use test ginagamit ito dun sa mga bagay na kailangan mong i-consider yung paano siya ginagamit in its actual context. Like let's say when you have broth cubes, 'di ba? Kasama na din doon yung hindi lang yung sensory parameters ng finished product na ginamit mo siya sa tinola, pero yung gaano ba ka-cumbersome buksan yung package, how easy is it to follow the instructions, is it easy to mess up this using this ingredient, for example, when cooking because of some technical issue with packaging or whatever. Okay, so yun.